Do you think you know the Middle Ages? Monasteries, prayers, holiness? Then get ready. Because what happened behind the walls of churches was closer to a horror movie than to paradise on earth. Before we continue, it is important to say one thing. This story was created for educational purposes. All the events you will hear about are part of medieval history. The video is not intended to offend any faith or culture. It is a story about how fear and faith shaped human life. In medieval Europe, the body did not belong to the person. It belonged to God, or Satan, and every breath could be proof of whose side you were on. Imagine you are 15. You have just been married to a man twice your age. The wedding is over, and your neighbors are standing behind the wall, waiting to hear the proof of your virginity. Without it, the marriage was considered invalid. In the Middle Ages, even the first wedding night was not about love. It was about the law and community control. Monks beat themselves until they bled to drive out temptation. Not once, not 10 times. Every day. It was called the practice of holiness. And the church encouraged such torture. Nuns confessed in their dreams that they were visited by demons. They woke up in panic, in tears, convinced that the devil had come to them. And do you know what the church did? It did not deny it. It made official records. They recorded night attacks by demons as real manifestations of evil. There is evidence that in some monasteries, nuns spoke of otherworldly pregnancies. Some historians consider this a consequence of hysteria and the pressure of confession, but the very appearance of such legends speaks to the depth of fear. In one 13th century legend from Toulouse, a nun was allegedly accused of having a child from a demon and burned along with her baby. Whether this actually happened is unknown, but even the legend itself reflects what people believed at the time. It was a world where even dreams could be evidence of a crime, where women and men believed that their bodies were doors through which the devil could enter the world. Can you imagine what it's like to be afraid of your own touch? In public squares, people confessed their sin of desire. Women were forced to admit that they had indecent thoughts. The punishment varied from fasting and flogging to death. The church created a whole chart of sins, a catalog of the flesh. For an act while standing, 3 days of fasting. For an act on Friday, 7. For an act during pregnancy, 40. This is not fiction. Such rules were actually recorded in penitentials from the 7th to 11th centuries. In these books, love became the arithmetic of sin, and desire, a debt to God. Priests said, the body is the temple of God. But they behaved as if this temple had to be walled up from the inside. Any desire was considered proof of the devil's presence. Even the thought of pleasure was a sin. Monks competed to see who could go the longest without food, sleep, or warmth. Some hung themselves by their hands during prayer so they wouldn't fall asleep. All this was done to subdue the flesh. This is where the dark anatomy of the Middle Ages began, when the body became the enemy and pain became proof of faith. When even love was seen not as a feeling, but as a trap of the devil. But these are not just legends or extremes. The Vatican and European archives contain real descriptions of confessions where people spoke of temptation in dreams, and the inquisitors interpreted this as a spiritual struggle. This is how a world was formed where fear was more important than reason. And if you think that all this is in the past, no. The Middle Ages are over, but we still carry its fear of the body. Only now it has different names: shame, sin, control. So get ready, because what people did to their own bodies in the name of God will surpass any horror movie. This is not a fairy tale. This is history, and we are just getting started. Do you think the church just preached morality? No, it literally set tariffs for sins. The so-called penitentials are medieval catalogs of sins of the flesh. Everything was there, down to the smallest detail. For an act while standing, 3 days of fasting. For an act on Friday, 7. For an act during pregnancy, 40. This is no joke. Such texts really existed in the 7th to 11th centuries. The Penitential of Theodore, one of the most famous, specified in detail what kind of penance corresponded to each sin of the flesh. Love was turned into arithmetic, desire into a debt to God. People came to confession and literally counted their sins. Father, I have sinned 3 times this week. Okay, 9 days of fasting. And so it went, for centuries. But it wasn't just personal faith, it was a legal system. Imagine a real medieval court. In the center is a man. Next to him are his wife, a doctor, a priest, and female experts. He has to prove that he is capable of intimacy, not metaphorically, physically, in front of witnesses. If not, the marriage was declared invalid. Such cases were recorded in France, Italy, and England in the 15th and 16th centuries. A well-known case occurred in Paris in 1587. The court considered a case of impotence. The man was forced to undergo a test in front of witnesses. He failed, and the marriage was annulled. This is not a myth, but a documented practice in early modern Europe. Sometimes women were also examined under oath to confirm their chastity before marriage. If there was no blood after the first night, the family could demand an annulment. In some regions, there were even so-called women's commissions that conducted examinations, and young brides, according to legend, sometimes mixed in chicken blood to save their honor and their lives. It was a world where the body became evidence. Impotence was a crime, and intimate life was a subject of legal proceedings. There were rumors about jus primi noctis, the right of the first night. Supposedly, a feudal lord had the right to spend the first night with a peasant's wife. There is no documentary evidence of this custom, but the fear of it was real. The chronicles of Scotland and northern France contain descriptions of similar stories, although historians consider them to be legends. But it was precisely the belief in such rumors that helped the lords keep the peasants in submission, because fear is also an instrument of power. Even those who were supposed to be sinless did not always withstand it. Priests who took a vow of celibacy lived with so-called church mistresses. They were not always punished. Sometimes they simply paid a penalty for the sin of the flesh. Thus, the church created a system where even sin could be legalized for a certain fee. And this was not an exception, but part of the usual church life. And now, one of the most famous myths, the chastity belt. We've all seen it in movies. A knight locks his wife in an iron lock before going on a campaign. In fact, such devices did not exist in the Middle Ages. These are late Renaissance inventions, and most of the famous exhibits are 19th century fakes, created for exhibitions or as humorous souvenirs. However, the myth took root because the idea worked better than metal. The fear of female freedom was stronger than any lock. Such stories, from penitentiaries to courts and legends, show how the body was turned into a mechanism of control. Holiness said, "The body is the temple of God," and fear added, "But this temple must be walled up." And perhaps this is where the greatest irony of the Christian world began. The more they tried to tame the flesh, the more it ruled them. Do you think that the greatest fears of the Middle Ages were about war or disease? You are mistaken. The most terrible enemy was considered to be one's own body. The church claimed that the devil could enter a person not only through sin, but even through desire. And people believed it. Nuns told of night attacks by demons. They woke up in tears, convinced that someone invisible had touched them in their sleep. And do you know what the church did? It did not deny it. The inquisitors actually recorded such stories in their reports, considering them evidence of spiritual struggle. Some monasteries even had confessional records where nuns described dreams that we would today call erotic. At that time, it was considered an attack by an incubus, a demon that seduces women. Its female counterpart was a succubus, a demon that seduces men. These images became so entrenched that the church assigned special priests to treat victims of such attacks, with prayers, fasting, and self-flagellation. In one of the most famous church treatises of the 15th century, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, 1487, authors Heinrich Institoris and Jacob Springer wrote about incubi and succubi as real creatures. They claimed that demons can mix their seed with human seed, and thus monsters are born. Today, this treatise is considered more of a manifesto of mass hysteria than theological science. But it was this treatise that launched a wave of witch hunts. It also gave rise to the most absurd episode of that time, the theft of male organs. The inquisitors recorded that women keep stolen body parts in chests and feed them grain. It sounds crazy, but it is a direct quote from the Malleus Maleficarum. And at the time, it was not perceived as a metaphor, but as proof of evil. Everything related to a woman's body, menstruation, childbirth, desire, could be interpreted as the mark of the devil. The inquisitors even believed that witches flew to Sabbaths, where they engaged in dark orgies with demons. Their protocols are a mixture of eroticism, fear, and religious fanaticism, written by priests who themselves condemned it. The paradox is that the more the church fought against the flesh, the more it described it. But not everything was just fanaticism. The other side of religious experience is mysticism. Holy women describe their visions as a spiritual union with Christ, often in forms that seem almost erotic to the modern listener. Saint Mechthild wrote that Jesus embraced her with the fire of love. Saint Catherine of Siena said that she united with Christ as a bride with her bridegroom. For them, it was an act of pure faith, but the words sounded as if religion itself could not escape carnality. And here is the main question. Was the church really fighting sin, or its own imagination? For how can you expel what lies within you? The archives of Naples, Cologne, and Toledo contain court records in which the accused, most often women, confessed to dreams with the devil. sometimes under torture, sometimes out of fear that otherwise they would be called witches. And even if these stories are not always reliable, they show how easily a person could become an enemy of God just for their own dreams. Medieval Europe lived in a paradox. Desire was called a sin, but it was described in thousands of pages. And the more they tried to destroy physicality, the deeper they plunged into it. Because there were no winners in this struggle. The body and faith fought within one person, and the battle lasted for centuries. Do you think that medieval people lived only in fear and prayer? No, they also laughed. Loudly, obscenely, to tears. And this laughter was more dangerous to the church than any sin. In Paris in 1444, the Feast of Fools was banned after drunken priests lit a censer with donkey bones and sang psalms backwards. The bishop called it satanic laughter in the temple. But even the ban did not help. The next year, the holiday returned. Once a year, the world was turned upside down. Priests became clowns, deacons became dancers, and psalms were sung backwards. Laughter rang out in churches, and processions turned into carnivals. It was a brief respite from fear, a day when even holiness allowed people to be human. Carnival became a safe way to let off steam. After months of fasting and repentance, the streets exploded with laughter, wine, and bodies. The body, which had been considered sinful all year, became the main character on this day. People danced, sang, and parodied priests. And there was a deep logic to this chaos. In order to endure constant fear, it was necessary to laugh at it at least once a year. Such a contrast seemed dangerous to the church. In the 14th to 15th centuries, the Feast of Fools and similar carnivals were banned dozens of times, but they returned again, like a force of nature stronger than any dogma. Ironically, even temples did not escape carnality. On old churches in Ireland, England, and France, you can still see stone figures of women exposing their bodies. They are called Sheelan-agig. They were installed on facades between the 11th and 13th centuries. No one knows exactly why. Some historians believe that they are symbols of fertility and protection from evil. Others believe that they are a reminder of the sin of the flesh. But the fact remains, medieval churches were decorated with female figures with naked bodies. Laughter and shame lived side by side, even in stone. Small metal badges in the shape of phalluses and even flying genital symbols were sold at fairs as jokes or talismans. Archaeologists find such artifacts all over Europe. The British Museum actually has dozens of such bronze badges from the 13th to 15th centuries. They were worn alongside crosses, medallions of saints, and even on the clothes of pilgrims. Folk piety and physical humor coexisted, and no one saw any contradiction in this. For the people of that time, the body was part of the world created by God, even if the church did not approve of it. Carnality also lived in literature. Short stories called fables were widespread in France. In them, monks stole women, nuns fooled confessors, and God watched from above with a smile. These were medieval anecdotes that mocked human weaknesses. Later, in the 14th century, Giovanni Boccaccio collected these stories in his Decameron, one of the most famous books in Europe, with the same theme: sin, desire, and hypocrisy. Even priests quoted fables in their sermons as examples for learning. Because humor, even if body, had a better effect on listeners than fear. The Middle Ages were not a monotonous darkness. It was a world of contrasts, between holiness and the body, between penance and laughter. When the carnival ended, everyone put their humility back on, but at least for one day, they felt alive. And it was this laughter that saved people from madness. Because if the church owned the soul, the body was the last thing that could be defended, even if it meant laughing through sin. Do you think pain and pleasure are opposites? Medieval Europe thought otherwise. Here, suffering was a form of love, and pain was the path to salvation. In the 14th century, processions of flagellants, people who whipped themselves until they bled, marched through the streets of cities. This was a movement of repentance that arose during the Black Death, 1348 to 1349, when millions died of the plague. The flagellants believed that suffering could avert God's wrath. Witnesses described how crowds knelt, and cries of pain turned into prayers. Sometimes this religious ecstasy bordered on madness. People cried, laughed, and fell into a trance. To an outsider's eye, it was horror. For them, it was purification. Chronicles wrote that women touched the blood of flagellants and smeared it on their children for salvation. These scenes seem fanatical today, but at the time, it was the logic of faith. Through wounds to God, through pain to love. The same ideas lived on in monasteries. Saints described how they rejoiced in suffering because they believed that God hears through pain. Catherine of Siena wrote, "A wound is a kiss from Christ." Other mystics spoke of the sweetness of torment, the feeling of unity with God in pain. This is no longer physical punishment, but spiritual ecstasy. And next to it is the other side of the same era, medieval medicine. In the 11th to 12th centuries, a group of doctors worked in the city of Salerno and created treatises called Trocula. This is one of the first medical collections in Europe dedicated to the female body. It advised on how to relieve pain during menstruation, how to prevent pregnancy, or how to restore fertility. Sounds modern? But back then, it was a mixture of medicine, magic, and prayer. The recipes recommended herbs, spells, and prayers to saints. Science and faith were intertwined, like two worlds that could not be separated. But there were also darker pages. Love potions, spells, herbs of Venus. These practices were widespread among ordinary people. Many recipes were recorded in inquisitorial cases. If someone fell ill or died after drinking such a potion, the woman was immediately accused of witchcraft. The fine line between folk medicine and serving the devil cost thousands of lives. At the same time, the church continued to preach. Through pain, to purity. Through punishment, to salvation. It was believed that through suffering, the body was purified and the soul became closer to God. Monasteries practiced asceticism, strict fasting, sleep deprivation, and hours of kneeling in prayer. This was called prayer through the body. It did not necessarily involve blood or cuts. It was enough to push oneself to the limit. Because it was at the limit, they said, that faith began. And there was a terrible logic to this. If the body is the source of evil, then the only way to purify it is to punish it. Thus was born a culture where pain became a form of worship. And in it, faith, fear, and something that even today seems like a strange, painful pleasure were intertwined. Medieval Europe believed that God wanted blood and the devil wanted flesh. But the line between them was blurred, and it was often difficult to understand who those who whipped themselves to blood and those who sought God in pain really served. Do you think the Middle Ages are long gone? That all these fears are just dust in old chronicles? You are mistaken. We no longer whip ourselves in public squares. We don't wear chastity belts. We don't look for incubi in our dreams. But that same fear of the body is alive. It has simply changed form. The Middle Ages taught Europe to fear its own body. It made shame a part of culture. And this legacy has not disappeared. It lives on in how we talk about desire. In the words sin, purity, decent, debauched. We still divide people into those who can and those who must remain silent. Today, we no longer call it obsession. We call it moral standards. We do not punish physicality publicly. We simply teach people to be ashamed of it from childhood. Medieval confession has turned into an inner voice that whispers, you can't do that. It's not proper. It's shameful. In the 21st century, this fear has only changed its costume. We no longer hide our bodies under robes. We hide them under filters, diets, and complexes. Now the punishment is not a whip, but a comment on social media. Not an inquisitor, but a crowd of likes and condemnation. We have created a digital inquisition, where anyone can judge someone else's physicality without looking them in the eye. The irony is that in this era of freedom, the body has once again become a battlefield between the natural and the decent, between acceptance and control. Now crosses have been replaced by screens, and new preachers, bloggers, and the media teach us how the body should be. We still repeat the old prayer, the same one that was heard under the lashes of the whip. Cleanse me of the flesh. Deliver me from desire. The Middle Ages ended 6 centuries ago, but its shadow has not gone away. It has simply become quieter, more intellectual, masked by ethics, tradition, or lifestyle, because they feared desire and turned it into a religion. And this religion has not disappeared. It has simply changed its temples. Now they are in our heads,